Hey everybody, welcome to the first video for Chapter 30. And for Chapter 30, we're going to be learning about the Cold War. Now, the Cold War was a very interesting time in world history, obviously involving the United States, but we're going to be looking at it from a global perspective. And it starts pretty much immediately after World War II ends, right, the late 1940s, and it lasts up until 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. And even though the Cold War was very much defined by this rivalry between the two superpowers, you see the flags here on your screen of the United States and the Soviet Union, it involved a lot more countries than that. Countries all over the world got involved, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes just in, trade issues, sometimes in actual fighting. So a lot of events to talk about. Let's get into the first one. The Cold War unfolds. All right. So you see, two big aspects of the Cold War here, the division of Europe and nuclear weapons. This conflict known as the Cold War, as I said, it developed almost immediately after World War II ended. The alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western nations fell apart when the Soviet army remained in Eastern Europe. Stalin refused to bring the troops out, and he forced those countries to adopt communist governments. Now, what this resulted in was a divided Europe. And it was divided between what we call the superpowers, right? As I said before, the Soviet Union and the U.S. They were the two most powerful nations in the world, and they dominated international relations all over the world. And examples of these two international relations are the international alliances that were formed, such as NATO. Right? NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That was an alliance instigated by the United States that was primarily made up of Western Europe. You do have the rest of North America, Canada, but who cares? That's in there also. And this was a military alliance saying that if one nation is attacked, that the others would agree to back them up. And as you can see, throughout the 80s and 90s, you had a lot of other nations that joined up. So now most of Europe is a part of it. To counter this, the Soviet Union created its own alliance called the Warsaw Pact. Let me just move me down here. And the Warsaw Pact, obviously, you've got Russia and the other Soviet states, and then you've got Eastern Europe, these orange shaded ones here, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. All right, so those are all part of the Warsaw Pact. Now, this division between East and West in Europe, it resulted in what Winston Churchill coined as the Iron Curtain. Right, the Iron Curtain was this unofficial division between East and West Germany. Churchill chose the metaphor because a curtain is something that is meant to block your view. But this ideological border was so severe that it might as well have been made from iron. There was no crossing back and forth, right? You couldn't travel from the Czech Republic into Western Germany. You couldn't decide that, okay, I'm just going to go from Austria here into what now is Slovakia. Back then it was Czechoslovakia. There were guards, there were barbed wire, right? Just freedom of travel didn't exist back then. The division between the capitalist West and the communist East, as you can see, it runs right through Germany. Okay, it divided Germany in two. The way that it worked here was, at the end of World War II, Germany was divided up into different zones among the Allies. The Russian, you got the red zone, you got the British zone, U.S., and even the French got a little bit in there. Why, I don't know. But the Russians got there first, and they got to Berlin first. So they said, we're not leaving. And so they divided it and they held on to it. So while the zones of the other Allies were eventually consolidated into West Germany, the Soviet Union implemented a communist government in East Germany, right? So West Germany became capitalist and democratic. East Germany became communist. Now, complicating things even more was the issue of Berlin, right? You look at Berlin here. Berlin itself, even though it is situated deep within the Soviet zone, that was divided as well into the same four sectors. Here you got French, British, and U.S. on the west, and then you've got the entire eastern part dominated by the Soviets. So Berlin itself kind of became a microcosm, a mini example of Germany as a whole, in that you have West Berlin, which remained kind of independent and separate. It almost became its own little island within East Germany. It remained capitalist, remained democratic, and politically remained completely apart from East Germany. It was not technically a part of East Germany. The only way in or out, actually, let me just go like this so that I can't do it there, but all right, I'll be able to, you guys will figure it out. The only way in or out was there was an airport in West Berlin that could take you into West Germany or other parts of Western Europe, and there was one highway that connected West Germany to West Berlin. Even early on, a lot of people in East Berlin were recognizing that this communist government thing was not really for them. So a lot of them would travel from East Berlin into West Berlin, maybe to stay, but a lot of them just to flee. And because so many people were fleeing to West Berlin to escape the communist regime, the Soviets decided to prevent this by building the Berlin Wall. Now, built in 1961, it divided Berlin in two. You could only pass through a certain amount of checkpoints, and violators trying to cross it illegally were arrested, sometimes even shot. Friends and family members were cut off, and this really became a symbol of communist repression. Anger at communist rule in other parts of Eastern Europe resulted in some uprisings, such as the Prague Spring. It was named for an uprising in Czechoslovakia, today the Czech Republic, capital of Prague. Student protesters demanded democratic reforms, but the uprising was brutally put down. Here you see, kind of as a symbol, something that looks like almost out of the French Revolution with Les Mis, with a young student waving a flag on top of a tank. But the reality is that the tanks and the Soviet troops vastly outnumbered and vastly outgunned the student protesters. The Soviets wanted to send a message. The message to not only Czechoslovakia but the rest of Europe was, this is what happens when you go against the Soviet Union. So they brutally put it down. Now, nuclear weapons, as I said, nukes were a defining characteristic of the Cold War, and it resulted in what we call an arms race. Both sides wanted to build up their nuclear arsenal as quickly as possible to use what we call nuclear deterrence. I'll come back to that in a second, but you see how the United States was winning the arms race pretty significantly in the 1950s and 60s. The Soviet Union kind of took advantage of anti-nuclear feelings in the U.S. during the 80s, right? During the 80s, there was an awful lot of protests in the U.S. to try and lessen our nuclear arsenal. Well, the Soviets are like, well, none of that going on here, so they really, really peaked. You can see here about the mid-80s, and now both sides have significantly decreased over the last 20 years or so. But there absolutely was an arms race, and as I said, it was meant to be deterrence, meaning that if the other side knows, like if the United States knows that the Soviet Union has nukes, they'll be less likely to attack. This became known as a balance of fear, right? This nuclear, you look at the political cartoon, every single person in the circle has a gun pointed on his back. So the result is that nobody's firing. But if one person fires, everybody's going to die. And that's kind of the idea of a nuclear deterrence. You look at this other one. Let's hope we never have to use it. Okay, this huge club that obviously the three of these cavemen couldn't handle on their own, and if they tried to, it would fall and it would crush them. That's the message of nuclear weapons, is that it would kill us all if we ever tried to use them. Now, eventually, this fear of nuclear weapons does start to kind of lead to an easing of tensions a little bit. All right, I don't want to make it seem like things got better overnight, but 1971, the United States and the Soviet Union reached what's called a détente. A détente is a lessening of hostility between two nations. This began in 1971 between Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev, you see him there, and then you have U.S. President Richard Nixon over here, where they signed kind of an official easing of tensions in order to try and lessen the nuclear arsenal. But as you see up on the chart up here, the Soviet Union didn't really abide by it over the next 10 to 15 years. This attempts at decreasing nukes actually started a couple of years earlier with this thing called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, this was not just between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was meant to involve many of the countries throughout the world. You look at the map. Now, besides the U.S. and the Soviet Union, your main countries that had successfully tested nuclear weapons, you've got Great Britain, you've got France, and you got China. Okay, those are your main ones that successfully tested them and became nuclear powers. Now, you also have what's called non-NPT nuclear weapon states. Those are nations that have nuclear weapons but are not signees, and this you're looking at the Indian subcontinent down here, which has created its own kind of issues in recent years, with rivalry between the two. Now you've got some abstaining countries in here, Australia and Canada. No one really cares about that, but also you've got what you look at high risk states: Iran and North Korea. Right? Those are countries that, for the United States and for a lot of countries in the world, can make you very, very nervous. Right? At high risk, you see even in the news today about talks between the U.S. and North Korea over nuclear weapons. All right. Now, the Cold War goes global. The U.S. and the USSR, they never actually came to fighting in the Cold War, but that doesn't mean that they didn't get involved throughout the world. We said earlier that the superpowers defined international relations, and this was often through what we call proxy wars. Proxy wars are wars instigated by a power that doesn't usually get involved. The Soviet Union instigated communist uprisings throughout the world. All right, while the U.S. worked to contain them. Remember Truman, right? This is a political cartoon. You got Stalin here and you got Truman there, and a chess match with, different nations throughout the world of how to, maneuver communism and then counter it and contain it with capitalism and democracy and so forth. Now, even though this one country wasn't involved in an actual proxy war, the area it became the area that almost led to actual war between the two superpowers. And here we're talking about Cuba. Now, Cuba is a small island country in the Caribbean, not too far from the coast of Florida. And in the early 1960s, Fidel Castro takes power. Castro was a young revolutionary, and he overthrew the dictatorship in Cuba that was very friendly with the United States. Castro was a staunch communist himself, and he quickly used that ideology to form a strong bond with the Soviet Union. Here you see him laughing it up with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. He was the leader of the Soviet Union throughout the late 1950s and early 60s. Now, this resulted in an American embargo where we basically shut down all sorts of trade with Cuba, and it remained that way for decades, and it only was lifted within the last couple of years. And that's why if you drive around Havana, you see cars out of the 1950s because they have not had anything new shipped in there in quite some time. So this U.S. embargo was very, very devastating to the economy of Cuba. Also, obviously, worsened relations between the two countries. Now, where this really almost came to a head, though, was with this thing called the Cuban Missile Crisis. All right. The Soviet Union, it was found out, had put nuclear missiles on Cuba, and they were pointed at the United States. Obviously, this is a problem. These spy planes picked it up, and this started a very, very tense, not an actual conflict, but kind of this battle of wills between Nikita Khrushchev, who we just talked about before, and President John F. Kennedy, JFK. All right. It was a staring contest. You look at the political cartoon here. You got Khrushchev, you've got Kennedy. They're both sitting on nuclear weapons. Right, and it's an arm wrestle, and they're struggling, and kind of sweat is pouring down. A lot more sweat coming on Khrushchev here. But you also look at what are their left hand fingers doing, hovering above a button, ready to press. The world wasn't sure, is this going to result in nuclear war? That was a very legitimate fear at this time. And for 13 days, the president, and you see him here with his attorney general, his younger brother, Bobby Kennedy, they kind of huddled and had to decide what to do. A lot of people in the United States, a lot of military leaders felt that we should just bomb Cuba, which would almost certainly result in war with the Soviet Union that could turn into World War III. And luckily, the staring contest was eventually won by Kennedy. And the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles along with some concessions from the United States. But the biggest thing was that the missiles were brought back to the Soviet Union, and there were no longer any nuclear threats pointed at the United States. All right, so real quick, just to sum up some things in the USSR and the Cold War, right? You guys can look at this on your own. But a communist government, the big thing here is command economy, right? They make all the decisions, not only political, but all economic decisions. They say what industries are going to make, how much they're going to produce, what you're going to pay your workers, and so forth. Democratic capitalism, market economy, supply and demand, right? The market makes all of it. You look at the political divisions, and then this thing of valuing obedience, discipline, economic security, freedom and prosperity. I mean, that's a little jingoistic. I mean, we like to talk about this stuff in America. It's not totally, 100% true all the time, but for the most part, yes, right? We value our civil liberties, we value our freedoms and so forth. So that is something that, we put a high priority on. Okay. So a lot going over in the beginnings of the Cold War. In the next one, we're going to be talking about how, Europe and Japan rebuilt after World War II.